Welcome to another episode of Athens and Jerusalem. Let's begin where we can't escape. Let's begin with Logos.
Now, I would say that this openness, this being in the world, this referring to the world, to objects in the world, what I would like to call self-transcendence, this is disappearing as soon as you project a human being into a lower dimension than its own dimension.
Point of the V goes up to the nuclear explosion that created it.
Tell me this, Dr. Oppenheimer. Do you ever become frightened at what you're finding out here in this area that can't be measured in either time or space?
You see, that's a real point.
Do not be afraid. Open your hearts, open up your hearts.
Open up your hearts to Athens and Jerusalem, the infants of our culture, united, independent, polarized, and even bloody. Athens, the cradle of wisdom and rationality. Jerusalem, the cradle of faith and spirituality. In this podcast, we look at reunion. Could reason be more than modern secular skepticism? And could spirituality be more than belief? Welcome to the second episode of our podcast, Athens and Jerusalem. Today, it's only me and Stephen talking. Cameron couldn't be with us, but we hope we're going to have a great time anyway. The topic we are going to have today is the one and the many. And I know you, Steve, you have some thoughts on the topic.
Well, somewhat scattered, but maybe even before starting to talk about the one and the many, we can say a word about the relevance of these sorts of deep philosophical topics to present day concerns. You know, why is this a topic that's even worth talking about? You know, it's something that philosophers have been talking about for millennia without seeming to come to any sort of agreement about. It's just this, nonstop argument between is everything one, is everything many. And I think one way to think about this, which is helpful, is to think of civilization and the history of ideas and everything that binds us together as a community, as a culture, as kind of like a tapestry or a carpet, which is comprised of different threads, the warp and the weft. And when you're making a tapestry or any sort of textile, you begin with these stretched threads, which are the warp, which are the backbone of the tapestry, and around that you weave the weft. And in the completed product, what you see is the weft and not the warp. You see the tufts of thread that stick out that determine the pattern of the carpet, and you don't see the threads of the warp, unless through continuous use, and wear the warp threads start to become visible. And in a way, we can think of these big ideas like the one and the many, and other ideas that historically the ancient Greeks were the first to debate. The question of change and stasis, question of purpose, and necessity, or purpose versus necessity, form and matter, being and becoming, the ideal and the real, subject and object. All of these are huge topics which we can think of as constituting these invisible threads that explain much of the structure of present day society, of civilization, but in a way they're invisible. We don't talk about them on a day-to-day basis. They're kind of deeply embedded within. And I think this question of the one and the many is one of those big invisible threads that is not a normal topic of daily conversation, but which deeply informs the way we look at the world, deeply informs the way that we navigate the world. And as a useful starting point, we can go back to these ancient Greeks, not so much because we can go back and see in them fully fleshed out theories about these fundamental ideas, because all that we have from them is extremely fragmentary. We have a quote here, we have a quote there, um, and so what we can maybe do is take certain statements by these ancient philosophers as helpful starting points, because others, even ancient Greek philosophers themselves, sort of treated these even more ancient philosophers like Heraclitus and Parmenides and others as reservoirs of snappy quotations that they could use to prove their own point or not. And so one great quotation that we can start with for this topic, comes from Heraclitus, in which he says, "Listening not to me but to the Logos, it is wise to agree that all things are one." And it's interesting, a little bit, maybe a little bit counterintuitive, because people like to distill or simplify these ancient philosophers to one big idea, and it's often for Heraclitus and Parmenides, they often get distilled into, well, Heraclitus was the philosopher of change. He said you can't step into the same river twice. And Parmenides is the philosopher that kind of opposes Heraclitus. He's the one that said that that all change is an illusion. But this statement of Heraclitus, that it's wise to agree that all things are one, seems to push against thinking of Heraclitus monolithically, thinking of any of these philosophers monolithically.
And I think your point on Heraclitus is very important, and because when we say that he was the one who talked about we could never step into the same river twice, then we are only telling half the truth, or maybe it's actually the same truth in that statement as in the statement about Logos. And I think it's very important to understand this. And I would also say that it's often said that Heraclitus, he wrote in aphorisms or just some fragments, but Gadamer's interpretation, he says that he must have been written whole theoretical ideas, and that's also something that's very important, I think, because we often put him like in a box where he's just talking about fragments. He's talking very dark and mysterious, but I think he has a huge idea.
Yes, and Gadamer talks about this, and how there must have been some very coherent ideas that at some point were expressed by people like Heraclitus, and he points out this beginning statement, and which so unfortunately is lost to history, that of this Logos which holds forever men prove uncomprehending, and really beginning this idea of there being a world which is manifest to our senses, a world which is visible, but also aspects of reality which are invisible. And to start with that as that's a very powerful starting idea for a philosophical system, because one could start with the opposite, which is everything that is real is manifest to the senses. But instead, starting from the perspective of, yes, there are things that are manifest, there are things that we can see and touch and describe, but then underneath that is something which is invisible, and something which has to be maybe perceived and approached through some other method than our eyes and our ears. You go in a very different direction from those two different starting points.
Yeah, so I think that's very important. If you still use the metaphor on the carpet, if we use our eyes, we would only see the complexity of the finished carpet and how every paradigm are looking, how it does, and the colors, and but we don't see the, what did you call it, the fundamental, the fundamental, and that's
the warp.
The warp, yeah. So I think that's a very nice metaphor, and to bring it back also, and I think also in in the scientific world I live, they often talk about how complex the world is. But
Mhm.
in some way, if of course, if we use our senses and if we look at every possible object and look at everything that is unique and has some kind of difference, and
Mhm.
it also changes at all time. So then, of course, it becomes very complex. But
Mhm.
if we are looking beneath and trying to ask more fundamental about what is the
Mhm.
what is actually going on, and what is
Mhm.
then I wouldn't call it simplify, but it's more it turns into fewer parts of understanding, and I think we should try to
Mhm.
do more of that when we are scientists today.
Yes. Yes. And that's and that touches upon, I think, an aspect of this warp of the one versus the many, which so deeply informs the way we navigate the world today, both in terms of our understanding of the physical world, but also socially. And that is that, on this question of the one and the many, the modern world, and by modern world, I'll say the last few centuries since, say, the scientific revolution, has been dominated by a scientific paradigm that is focused really more on the side of the many rather than the side of the one. And of course, immediately I can say in response to that, well, there's of course an attempt in physics, for example, in all of the sciences to try to take this world of the many and reduce it to the one by finding, say, the mathematical principles that unite. So there's a strong tendency towards unity. But this process of finding the unifying laws behind things is carried out in practice by analyzing things into parts, by breaking things into their components, and then understanding those component parts in isolation.
Yes.
Anyone who's taken an introductory physics class knows that just about every problem in your problem sets has something to do, if it has something to do with the real world, includes a kind of step of simplification that allows you to assume that this process of analysis is totally correct. So for example, you calculate the velocity of a ball rolling down an inclined plane and you're told to ignore friction, or you're told to calculate, the rotations of planets around, around a sun, ignoring the influence of other planets that may be nearby. In all of the sorts of day-to-day problems, we allow ourselves to take the step of simplification, which allows us to ignore all the other effects that we know theoretically are there, but for the sake of the problem, let's just ignore everything else and just focus on these terms that completely dominate. And that turns out to be an extremely efficient and extremely powerful way of understanding the world. And this assumption of things being completely separate ends up being the pathway towards uncovering, many of these laws of the universe that are extremely useful to us.
Yes.
But
But you could also, because you can also see the same patterns, the same paradigm in the social science.
Yes.
And especially because this is, I would say it started in the 60s and the 70s, not before, but after when they compared something, some of them actually said that we should only look after what is different, not what is similar. So they were focusing on differences and trying to split everything into unique parts.
Mm-hmm.
This has also something this is actually a moral statement, because they didn't want us to be cultural difference. So they didn't want to, we are more similar than they are, and so this kind of, so they tried to make everything unique.
Yes.
And it also in many ways it has ended with we are only analyzing and not synthesizing. So we are not
Mhm.
trying to make the unity that the physics, the science of physics are doing. So we are
Mhm.
only analyzing, and to analyze means to split. It means to just tear everything apart. And
Mhm.
that's what they're doing with
Mhm.
empirical methods. So they're
Mhm.
just tearing everything apart, and it's no, then they're not even trying to make a synthesize, to bring it together in any way.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And another way in the social sciences in which this, let's say, bias towards the many over the one has a huge influence is in things like Darwinian natural selection, which in its simplest form we think of each organism as competing with every other organism for scarce resources. And that gives us a picture in which we individual human beings are fundamentally at odds with other human beings. We're all in a state of competition, and the strongest survive. And as with everything, all other creatures on the planet as well. And this view, which is really a view of in which the many takes precedence over the one, has obvious consequences for the kinds of social arrangements we feel are going to be ideal. But already as science progresses, as we understand more and more deeply, the laws of the physical world, of the biological world, there's a kind of return from the many to the one that we can see. As we understand, say, the physics of particles better, we realize that yes, it's useful to see the world and interpret the world as divided into individual atoms, and to understand that everything in the end is comprised of atoms. Yet we also realize that fundamental particles, of which there are a few discrete types, are identical to each other within each type. So, for example, electrons and quarks, that every electron is identical to every other electron, like mathematically identical. They are, an electron in a way can simply be described by a few quantum numbers. There isn't some extra stuff that makes one electron unique from another electron. So there's a kind of strange unity behind this multiplicity of appearances. And Plato had a sense of this too, going again back to the ancient Greeks. Plato, of course, didn't know about atoms and didn't know about about quantum numbers and so forth, but he saw that there were certain repeating patterns in the world. And he inferred from that, well, a horse looks kind of like, has very similar characteristics to other horses of a species. And so it's natural to imagine that, well, maybe there's some form or some archetypal reality, of a horse out of which all horses are made, a kind of a cookie cutter stamp. When you see a bunch of cookies and they're all of the same shape, you imagine, okay, there must be a cookie cutter stamp out there that's making all of these cookies to be exactly that shape. So there's a natural sort of tendency to want to infer the existence of some kind of forms that underlie the multiplicity of things, that give a kind of unity to this world of appearances. And even again, following Plato's thread in this great sort of warp of this idea, even Plato wondered, well, maybe out of this multiplicity of forms, they're derivative of still greater and more fundamental forms, like what is true, what is good, what is beautiful. And maybe those three fundamental forms themselves are all aspects of one, great form that unites everything else. And maybe it can all be reduced to one behind that.
Yes, and I think because there's a Norwegian philosopher, he understands that in the end there is only one thing we are actually looking for, and that's the good. In the
Yes.
Plato's writing, and he calls himself a henologue.
Mm-hmm.
Henology is to learn about the one.
Mm-hmm.
And it's so he's but before, because we have to, I think that's we have to make some argument why we should try to also to find what brings us together, what is the one or the patterns that is fundamental for everything. But there was something you said about this competition, or what we should say, that I think it's very interesting that we are living, in many ways, we live in a society where we don't feel we really belong to the world. We don't belong to reality. And I think that this scientific way of thinking is one of the problem. And I think also that because when natural science in the 17th hundred, we became in many ways split, or we were not part of nature anymore. We were the one that were able to create nature, or not to create, but to explain the law of God in many ways. Yeah, that would Newton would say that.
Yes, and we John Wheeler, the great physicist of the mid 20th century, put this in the following terms. He said that the way that scientists thought about the world was as though there were a 10-centimeter thick glass wall separating us from the things that were being observed. You know, that there's this, and philosophically you talk about this as a separation between the subject and the object, and that was part of the approximation that worked so well in the first few centuries following the discovery of the scientific method, to assume that the subject and the object were two completely different things. But we come into the 20th century and we realize, oh, hold on, there's actually an intimate connection between the subject and object, that it's really only a first order approximation, maybe in some cases a second order approximation, that we can assume this kind of glass wall in between us and the world. But when you get to the observation of fundamental particles, you realize that you cannot separate the observer from the thing being observed. The two form a single system. And this idea of the unity of the subject and object coming together has been seen, I think, across the board in other disciplines as well. I mean, just to give an example of maybe our initial sort of way of interpreting Darwinian natural selection is that everything is competing, every individual thing is competing. But you get a little bit farther into the theory and you realize that actually one thing that emerges from this huge, blooming, buzzing confusion of things competing against each other is you have also cooperative units. And cooperation can also be an element in the evolution of things. And then you have this idea of ecosystems, of entire assemblages, not just of individual ants cooperating to form a nest or bees cooperating to form a hive, but different species which in their own ecological niches may be competing, nevertheless are in a kind of a symbiosis within a given environment. And so in the biological world, you have a kind of initial, let's say, way of understanding it as resolved into these individual component parts that are all competing. But then when a deeper understanding leads you to understand, well, there are maybe more slender threads, maybe less visible threads, but that like spider web threads, that weave the thing together into a single organism almost. And that's the case also with the world all the way down at the quantum level, but working our way up to the level of biology and working our way up to the level of human systems, of civilizational systems. And that's where the rubber really starts hitting the road in terms of, okay, starting with this very abstract idea of, well, is it the one or the money? And people have been arguing about this for thousands of years. Well, it comes to the present day. How do we look at ourselves in the present day vis-a-vis society? How do we look at the individual vis-a-vis society? Are we just in competition with everybody else for scarce resources, and whoever ends up with the biggest pile of money wins, or the biggest or the most power wins? Or do we see ourselves more as a kind of interconnected web of relationships, and that in a way is a higher reality? and it's not choosing one or the other. It's not saying one is right and the other is wrong, but depending on the lens we're looking at, depending on the level at which we're doing the analysis, it either we're seeing individual bricks in a building, or we're seeing the building as a whole.
I think it's very. We should write a new textbook for children, actually, is in natural science, to write well in a way that they understand that they are part of nature and not divided from it. I think that what is interesting in social science is that they had this idea that we were not, because they were criticizing Descartes and the solipsistic
Dualism.
theory. Not only the dualism, but also his method, because his method was very solipsistic, which means that he was alone, sitting by himself and trying to understand everything. And they started to think that no, that's not how, because language is not something you can create by yourself, and you can't think languagely through yourself. You have to have more people around you. So intersubjectivity became a huge part of the thinking in social science. But it's an epistemic. That was the beginning. If you read Habermas, you will see that is explaining. He used intersubjectivity to understand how we do experience something, not how we explain, not the ontological. Was how to say it. It doesn't. In his writing, it doesn't say that intersubjectivity or social constructivism is to create the world. It is only the way we actually are able to understand the world by being explored by the world. But the problem is that social constructivism nowadays have turned into some kind of human being able to create their own world by creating new words. So they believe that human actually are not part of the reality in any way. It's just something we are creating by turning new language into the world. We are creating a new world. And this is, for me, the largest split between subject and object, or between human and reality. So for me, this is one of the biggest problems in social science today, that this kind of thinking actually, they really believe human are gods, I would say. So that's one of the biggest problems I see. But social constructivism as an epistemic fundament, I think it's correct, but not as an ontological creation of reality. And I think that's very important to understand.
I know as someone with a physics background, I'm supposed to argue against social constructivism, which might be said to be like the mortal enemy of of things like fundamental physics. But taking the devil's advocate for a moment, I feel like there's a strong argument to be made for the creative power of words and ideas. I think one great example of this is Yuval Harari's *Sapiens*, where he describes, I think very convincingly, just how powerful the realm of ideas and words is in constructing the social reality that we inhabit. For example, take the idea of money, which is so governs our every our every movement in the world, which is completely an invention of ourselves, but it has in effect created its own world. Of course, not literally created the world, but let's even take that idea for a moment and allow ourselves to fantasize. And again, my inspiration here is John Wheeler, and John Wheeler's idea that once you eliminate that glass wall, that glass barrier between us and the world, and you realize that the observer and the thing being observed form a single system, you're also led to down the path to what may seem on the face of it extremely counterintuitive ideas, such as that this universe we exist in is a participatory universe. It is built out of interactions between things. In a way, it's even built out of our measurements of things. For example, the state of a quantum system is not determined until it is measured. What exactly does that measuring? No one knows. There's still an abundance of theories and no way to at this point to eliminate theories which on the face of it seem like completely different from each other. Some theories would say that consciousness itself is generative of reality. Wheeler would say this when he talks about our observations, for example, of distant quasars and the gravitational lensing of these distant quasars by intervening galaxies. And the mere observation of that quasar almost forces, really does, in a mathematical way, forces the light that reaches our telescopes to pick a path around the galaxy to reach that telescope. That path was not determined until the observation was made. And so somehow the observation forces the light ray to do something that happened billions of years ago. And if you take that idea and extrapolate even farther back to the moment of the Big Bang, then you can make an argument that our observation of and participation in the universe is generative of the universe as a whole. This is an idea of which was summarized by Wheeler as it from bit. The thing itself is a result of information. And information here is a stand-in for this idea of consciousness and the act of observation and so forth. And what this represents is a new pathway forward that the ancient Greeks never thought of. Aristotle being the first to ask these questions about, what is the cause of things? How are things brought about in the end? Really could only think of two possibilities. He thought, everything is caused by something, and those somethings are caused by other things. And so Aristotle asked in his metaphysics, he said, what are the possibilities here? Either you have to have an infinite regress and the causes just go back, sort of infinitely far back in time, which he rejected as being incoherent. Or the second possibility is, at some point, that chain of causes ends with something which itself has no cause. And this is the famous uncaused cause of the final books of the metaphysics that Christian theologians latched onto as a very convenient way of inserting a theological idea of God into creation. But what Aristotle didn't think of was a third possibility, and that third possibility is that the chain of causes bends around itself and ends up becoming self-caused, so that the farther back in time you go, eventually you come back to the starting point. And this is I think very much aligned with this idea of Wheeler about the participatory universe, and that idea that eventually consciousness reaches a point where its very act of observation, its act of moving in the world, is generative of the world itself all the way back in time. It's a very heady concept. And this concept actually was, I think, you can go in so many directions with this. Ancient, mystics of all sorts of traditions have this idea of the consciousness being somehow generative of the universe itself. You have these various ideas which are expressed metaphorically in the symbol of the Ouroboros, of the snake swallowing its tail, which is this constant renewal of creation, and the cycles of death and rebirth. You have a circular notion of the universe as opposed to a linear notion of the universe.
Yeah.
But
Heraclitus also have this circle, I would say, between death and life.
Mm-hmm.
And also Plato he believes in reincarnation,
Mm-hmm.
and he believes in change as something that has always been.
Yes.
So there's like a unity in what is actually been going on for all
Mm-hmm.
time. Why it's always interesting how Aristotle interprets Plato, because
Mm-hmm.
he's I wonder sometimes that he can't have read everything that we are actually have the ability to read nowadays.
Yeah.
So I wonder. Sometimes I really wonder, I read a lot of people being being critical to Aristotle's interpretation of Plato,
Mm-hmm.
and also, of course, the Nietzsche interpretation of Heraclitus is very problematic, because
Yeah.
he's the one that makes him into a relativist and to this
Yes.
flow, and so logos, and
Yes.
I think what you express as consciousness, could that be what Heraclitus means by logos?
Yes. I think the two are must be highly related to each other. You know, for Heraclitus, the logos is more of an ordering principle, but it's also the principle of well, later on in this idea of the logos has this incredible history throughout thought, but it begins as something very closely related to the notion of cosmos, you know, the sort of interconnected, you know, web of things. But it also takes on its own kind of generative meaning in the Gospel of John, where in the beginning was this logos, you know, and the logos was with God, and the logos was God. It's something which was somehow separate from the creative principle, somehow with the creative principle, and this logos, it becomes flesh and dwells among us. It's something that has a manifestation in the world, and it's something that you mentioned Nietzsche. I mean, Nietzsche, I think, also intuited something about this at the end of The Will to Power, which is this collection of essays published posthumously. There's this there's a beautiful paragraph where he identifies. He says, do you want to know what the secret of everything is? Basically, he says it is this will to power. He says he calls it a monster of energy. He says it's, you know, without purpose, but it's just out there, you know, creating and smashing and destroying, and there's no perfection or anything in it unless it's the perfection of the circle, because it's infinitely generative and regenerative. It's like the circle of life and birth itself. And he ends up defining it as the will to power. And Schopenhauer also had a similar idea that that in the end everything is, and this basically encapsulated in the title of his magnum opus, which is the world as will and representation. You know, we see the world as representation, which is, you know, Kant's idea of all we have access to are the phenomena, but underneath that are the noumena, the things that can't be observed. And Schopenhauer identified that with the will, which is, I think, a variation of Nietzsche's will to power, that sort of underlying everything. And this is the logos principle, is this raw sort of energy, this raw force that wills itself into being. But whereas Nietzsche and Schopenhauer interpreted this, I think, in more pessimistic terms, they saw it as blind, they saw it as almost something that we want to free ourselves from. You know, we get trapped in this cycle of birth and death. You know, in the Buddhist sense, you want to free yourself from it. You become a prey or a slave to instinct, and you want to sort of, you know, break yourself out of the instinct of this will which dominates all things. But I think there's a way that one can look at it in more positive terms, that, you know, this will, this primal will, this thing which is the logos principle, is generative in the sense of the in the sense of the participatory universe of Wheeler, or in the sense of the logos of the Gospel of John. We can look at will itself, consciousness itself, as this ordering principle that is constantly in this process of birth and death, and that is ever giving rise to its own being. Seeing the world in those terms is, I think, complementary to seeing the world as divided up into many, divided up into separate scattered things. Those separate scattered things all manifest to some in some limited way, the reality of that will, of that energy, of that logos that underlies everything. And it brings all things together so that maybe at one level of approximation, to bring it to the sort of present day, crisis of civilization, we can, at one level of approximation, we can see ourselves as separate beings in competition with each other, or temporarily gathered up into tribes, nations, races, and so forth that are fundamentally in competition with each other. Or we can go to a deeper level and understand that behind all of this froth of the physical world, behind all of this living and dying and struggling and so forth, is a single light that's shining, is a single ocean, underlying all things, of which we are the waves and drops, and which gives a kind of, not just a unity to the human experience, but gives a kind of overarching purpose and goal to the human experience. Because again, one of these threads of the warps, that run through civilization, is this question of, well, is everything purposeless? Is it just atoms in the void bouncing around, like Democritus said, or is there purpose underlying everything? And one way to understand how we can see purpose underlying things is in relation to this concept of will and the self-generative power of the will. If that's how the universe came into being, then there is a direction to things. We're not born into a purposeless universe. We're born into a universe that is going somewhere. Where is that universe going? Where is humanity going? Where are we individually going? We're going in the direction of consciousness, because the direction of consciousness is the direction of creation. And that gives us a kind of a point of unity to rally around as a species and as a united ecosystem on this planet, that we are all manifestations of this infinitely generative will.
You sounds like Hegel in many ways, and because he also believed that like the consciousness, like that was the final the point, and he understood that was something we actually came to birth with Napoleon. So it was a little bit, maybe it was
somehow it stopped with like the evolution of the modern German state for him. Strangely enough, one ends up with not enough imagination to extrapolate beyond.
but this argument about the light and actually there are something good, and this is also between the difference between chaos and cosmos.
Mm-hmm.
And Plato he tried in many of his dialogue, he tried to explain why he believed that it was the good that actually existed as the measurement of everything. And he believed that logos and the good was the same. And that and one of his metaphor was on the light, the difference between the dark and the light. And he tried to explain the God to be good or to be evil in the same in the same thoughts as dark and light. That means that the light does exist, but darkness doesn't exist. Darkness is only the lack of absence of.
Yes.
So, and that's the same way he explained good and evil, that good is something that exists and evil is actually only lack of. It's absence of good. So if somebody is doing something that is bad, it's only lack of goodness that is taking part of what the person is doing.
Yes.
And he would say the same with beauty, the difference between the beauty and ugliness. Then, if we could say that would be also the same. That ugliness is only a lack of beauty.
Yes. And one of his most influential students, not direct student in his lifetime, but in the school of Plato centuries later, Plotinus, who was working in the late Roman Empire, took this idea of light and turned it into a whole metaphysics of light, almost, with the idea of emanation, that there's an emanation of from the one, and that everything can be seen as degrees of light emanating from this singular principle, in which also in this idea, in this metaphysics, there is no darkness. Darkness has no reality of its own. It's simply different degrees of light. But still within that, we have to somehow account for the evil that we see in the world. Because evil does exist in a real sense, in the sense that we're all familiar with on this planet. And it's perhaps too easy metaphysically to dismiss the existence of evil and say, well, there's only light and degrees of light. But when you're face to face with evil itself, you realize there has to be a way to understand that as well. How do we get light and darkness from a way of seeing the world which is just which is entirely dominated by this idea of logos?
Yeah, and this was Plato was of course aware of this, and he knew that if human was able, they would do evil things if they didn't get recognized, or they could still have a good reputation. They would do evil even with consciousness. So he didn't underestimated humans, but he tried to explain how logical, if we are really thinking of it, is it really good to be unjust or to be evil? Is this something that is actually something you want to do or want to? If you, how to say it, really feel that you are part of what is. I mean, so in his speaking, he would say that if humans should be able to do good, they have to have a whole theoretical worldview. Not only this is something you should do in your life today, or the handbook of something or anything, but you have to have a whole understanding of what really exists and what you are as a human being, part of the existence. You have to be part of theoria. That's the only way if we are to do good. So that would be his answer. His answer would be that you have to understand logos. You have to understand the one. You have to really to learn about the one and to be part of the one.
Yes, and going back to that initial statement of Heraclitus, it is wise, listening not to me but to the logos, it is wise to agree that all things are one. Which is such an amazing statement, because it's not a matter of this is the way things are. I think even as, at that early stage, I think even then they understood that you can argue different points of view. The sophists were famous for that, just arguing different points of view based not on what they thought was really true, but based on, getting someone to a certain point, more, let's say, as an exercise of power or something like that. And even today, we realize for these warp threads that run through our history, we understand that there are justifiable ways of looking at the world in terms of the many, and ways of looking at the world in terms of the one. And which one we choose is a function of wisdom. It's a function of what is the need for the day, what are the exigencies of the day, and how can we and should we act together in relationship to those exigencies. And I think one overarching idea, at least in my thinking, is that the way of looking at the world as separate has not run its course, but has reached a point where it needs to be increasingly balanced by this way of looking at the world as integral, as organic, as evolutionary, and deeply interfused and interconnected. And so it's a matter of, it's not so much a scientific question of like finding the right scientific theory that proves this point, because there are competing theories that are, let's say, equally valid within their own domains. And so the real challenge then is to find an overarching narrative within which these sub-narratives can find validity. And I can say this from the perspective of scientific theories, but more importantly, it can be said from the perspective of human theories that enable human beings to act together coherently on this planet. At the largest level, we're talking about religious systems. We're talking about, at the theological level, at the level of social teachings, at the level of any level you can imagine, there are these great chasms between belief systems. And I think the crying need of the day is to find overarching narratives that can validate these different systems of belief and see them as all expressions, relatively true expressions within some larger narrative. I guess in some way it's looking for another grand narrative. And I know that this whole quest for grand narratives has a bit of a questionable, has produced questionable results, over the last few centuries. But I do think this is what the world needs as a matter of wisdom, as a matter of exigencies of the day, as a matter of common survival, because if we don't find some overarching grand narrative, we're going to end up destroying ourselves. Maybe in a few generations.
So you don't believe in people just listening to logos?
Oh, of course I do.
Because
but what people hear will be different.
No, that's the point of Heraclitus, I think, is that if we actually are listening to our wisdom or logos or truth, if we actually choose truth, then we will listen to the same. We will listen to the one. And that's the point.
Maybe that's a very good point to stop on and to start our next session with. Is this question, because it's a huge question. This is a major question. If we are all in good faith seeking the truth, are we necessarily all going to come to the same conclusions about in what that truth consists? Or is it possible that good faith explorations of the truth will actually lead to different conclusions based upon whatever, different cultural presuppositions that we can't get out of, different habits of mind that are somehow intrinsic to us as individuals? Are there aspects of human diversity which are ineradicable, which we don't want to eradicate because maybe they're part of the strength of humanity and not, they're a feature and not a bug. And if that's the case, then maybe our various explorations of the truth will necessarily lead to different, say, religious systems, or different, some people who say it's many and other people who say it's one, as one example. Is that the sort of future that we have in front of us? Or, as you're suggesting, is it possible that if we just do it right, and if we're doing it in good faith, and we find some common set of principles to work with, are we necessarily going to get to the same idea of what is true and beautiful and good?
Yeah. So to the listeners, it would be nice to read the dialogue of Plato and think of it as all the different kind of possibility of thinking, trying to think logical about the same thing and see, is it one answer that is the correct answer, or is it many? I think that would be very nice. So read the Gorgias dialogue, for instance. So thank you for this time. You have been listening to Athens and Jerusalem, created by Cameron Namdar, Stephen Phelps, and Knut Ove Essay. Nora Juel is the broadcast voice and technical support. Music is pieces of Edvard Grieg's Morning Mood. The voices in the intro are Viktor Frankl, interview with Robert Oppenheimer and Pope John Paul II. Thank you for listening, and please check out another episode.